Hello and welcome to Conway Video. So in this video, I'd like to talk to you about the idea of breaking up your changes. So when you're faced with a complex, difficult, um, maybe a very large piece of code and you need to make it do something different and you're just so overwhelmed you don't know where to begin, this technique can be a really good technique of breaking up the changes. So let's get into it. What do I mean by breaking up the changes? I actually got inspired by inspiration for this video from a book called Refactoring, Working with Legacy Code. Working with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers, and it's a pretty big book. I haven't even finished the whole book myself, but I've read quite a large chunk of it. But the idea, one of the real central ideas of this book, is, I think, an absolute genius idea, and that is that rather than necessarily breaking up your code, you should break up the changes that you make to your code. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, look, say you've got this really big class and it's got hundreds and hundreds of methods and hundreds of properties, and then it's got this one really big method, and the method has lots of different function calls in it, and it's doing all kinds of things with variables and loops and if statements and so on, right? It's a complete mess. It's a jungle. And all you want to do is make one change. But that change, a lot of other things are going to have to move around. So, you read through the code, you understand it as well as you can. But at the end of it, you find that, that change is going to require quite a number of different things in that file to change. Now, what you absolutely don't want to do, and I can verify this with experience, but you can probably kind of work it out, logically as well. What you probably don't want to do is make all the changes at once. You don't want to go bam, 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 and make hundreds of changes to the file. And why don't you want to do that? Well, one thing is that if you do that, then you're going to have a difficult time keeping track of all the changes, like mentally keeping in your head what the changes that you made are. That's going to be difficult. I mean, it's hard enough just keeping the whole structure of the thing in your head, but then if you have to also keep track of like hundreds of little things that you changed, that's going to be even more hard. And then a second thing that's going to be problematic about doing all these different little changes at once is that you're going to have a difficult time testing whether they work. Because suppose you make 10 changes, right? 10 changes, and then you run the code and it breaks. There's an error. Now, the problem is you don't necessarily know what caused the error. I mean, you might have a very good hunch, but you've made 10 different changes, right? So you don't know which one of those changes caused it to break. And you don't even know which combination. Maybe it was 2 of those or 3 of those changes in combination. So actually, you've got kind of like n you've got an exponential kind of increase. You've got 10, at least 10 to 10 squared number of changes, that combination of changes that could have caused that code to break. So what's the better way of doing it? Well, the better way is to still make those 10 changes, but to make them one at a time. And the way that you do this is you plan out what changes you need to make, and then you just make one, or it could be 2 changes that you need to make, but you break the changes down. So you only make a very small number of changes each time. So you make one group of changes. Maybe you extract a piece of code into a separate method, all right? So you just make that change, and then you stop and you test the code, and maybe you even do a commit at that point if the code works. So, and then you make your next change. So maybe your next change is that you're going to rename a variable, and then you're going to have to rename all the instances where it's used. So you do that rename. Okay, done. Test the code again. Oops, something broke. So then you know what broke, right? You have a clue what broke, because you can then undo, Control Z or revert your change, and then see that the code works again. And so you can easily isolate the fact that it's just that one change that you did to the variable name that caused the code to break. And then what do you do? Well, then you obviously go and figure out why that caused the breakage, and then you go and fix the code. And if you work in this way, then the beauty of breaking your changes down, so you just make one part of the change at a time and gradually move the code and move it until it gets into the state that you want it to be, which is the end state, which is either it's refactored and it's cleaner, or maybe it works. Maybe there's a bug and you fix the bug. But at each stage, you're verifying that the code works, that the program works. You're running tests, maybe manual tests, maybe even automated tests if you have that. And at each stage of your changes, so each change, you're running a test and you're verifying that the application works. And that's beautiful because that means at each stage you can also go back. If something breaks, you can go back to the previous change. But at the end of all your changes, what do you have? Well, you have a nice clean set of commits, and someone else can come back later and go through the commits and see all your changes. But the point is, at the end of it, you have a working code base. You've got your change. You're in control of what your changes were. You know what they were. You understand them, and you've been able to verify at each step in the process that your changes had the correct effect. Now, this book, Working with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers, I absolutely love this book, but it is quite kind of firm about TDD. But I think the ideas in this book can be applied even if you're not working in a TDD fashion. So even if you're not writing your tests first and then making them fail and then making them pass, or maybe you only have a few tests here and there, or maybe you don't even have any tests, I think these principles can still be really useful. They can still be applied. Again, when I read books, and I'm going to do another video about this, but when I read books and learn about methodologies like, say, TDD or Agile or domain-driven design or any other number of methodologies, solid principles, object-oriented programming, any of these things, I always try to think of these as tools. They shouldn't be thought of religiously. I try not to think of them as this is the only one correct way to do it. Instead, I try to think of each of these things as tools, and in the right situation, I can take that tool and apply it. And so when you're dealing with a large legacy code base and you need to refactor it and maybe fix some bugs, you can take a book like Working with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers, and you don't have to follow everything the book says. You can just take out the grains of or the pieces of gold or the grains of truth from that book that apply to your situation, and then you can use those just in a way that fits with your situation. And that's kind of why I really liked this book, because at the end of the day, even if I'm not working with thoroughly unit tested code, or I'm not working in a TDD sort of environment, that idea of breaking up the change, of each sort of breaking my changes to the code into steps, and then each step of the way making sure it works, I think that's a really powerful idea in itself. That's a really good way of working. And it's often much easier to work that way than to try and break the code up. When you try and break the code, say you have this one big module and you're trying to separate it into two modules, in order to do that, you have to change so many different things at once that it can just get confusing, it can get messy, and you might end up breaking the application and creating bugs that you didn't know about, and then the customers come and complain and it's just not working out. Whereas if you break up the changes to the module, so you might not break this module completely apart, but you take two parts of it and separate them, and then you take another two parts and separate them. When you do it like that, then you've broken it down, you've broken the problem down, you've made it a smaller problem, and you can tackle each part of the problem, each smaller sub-problem one at a time. And then at each stage and each step in that process, you have confidence that your code works. And so yeah, I think that I am a big fan of TDD. I really like the ideas of unit testing and test-driven development, but I also think that there is a place for not necessarily applying those principles, but still taking some of the ideas. And the idea I really like, one of the ideas I really like from that whole school of thought, is the idea of confidence in your code. We want to feel confident that our code works, and so what better way to feel confident that our code works than to be making small changes, and each change that we make, testing the code all over again. If we have to do it manually, we do it manually, but whatever way we test it, we test the whole thing at each stage, and that way we have confidence that by the time we've gotten to the end of our changes, the whole thing still hangs together and still works properly. So yeah, the Michael Feathers book I highly recommend. And then there's another book also called Refactoring by Martin Fowler, or I think it's got a longer title, but it's about refactoring. That book also is really cool because in that book he actually breaks down a bunch of different moves, and they're kind of like jujitsu or something, or they're like dancing moves or something. They're basically these small changes you can make to code one at a time. But if you have all these in your head, then when you're working with the code, you can see what you want to do, and I'll do this refactoring. I'll do that refactoring. And so that book is also quite a nice book to read when you're doing this sort of incremental work with legacy code. You can break when you're breaking your changes down. Some of those changes can just be simple refactoring, such as what the refactoring book by Martin Fowler might suggest. Maybe you extract a method here. Maybe you slide a method call here. Maybe you extract a parameter here. All these sort of small tools, they're like little jiu-jitsu or karate moves where you can do lots of these small things, and when you put them all together, it really adds up to something. But the beauty of it is that they're actually really small moves, so you can just learn them one at a time, and eventually you become, I guess, a refactoring ninja or a refactoring master, and you're able to do this stuff almost without thinking about it. So yeah, that's my thoughts on making changes, breaking up the changes into smaller changes and making them one at a time. Thanks for watching.